Welcome to the new episode of All That Jazz. I'm your host, Matjash, or Matt, and I have with me Theodore Dalrymple. And I never thought I'd have Theodore Dalrymple on my podcast, and he's an author of Life at the Bottom, The Worldview of the Underclass, Our Culture, What's Left of It, and many other books. But these are most notable. And Spoiled Rotten is another very influential book, I think. And he was a doctor, a psychiatrist, and now he's most well known as I would say, a very influential author and brilliant thinker. So thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you. I don't think I am very influential, incidentally.
See, I'm trying to exert my will, and so you'll be influential as because I feel like your work will be more influential as time goes on, because people find your work and I think they resonate with it. Like, I didn't find your work until I don't know if you know Thomas Sowell.
Yes.
So Thomas Sowell has you, and he has a section on his website called suggested readings, and he's like, these are the books, if you want to grasp the basics of something, read this book. So your book, Life at the Bottom, was on his list because in his view, the underclass in Britain has the exact same attitudes as the underclass in the United States. And in his view, it has nothing to do with race. It has all to do with culture.
Yes, that's why he liked the book, of course.
Yes.
Because it bore out what he had always thought.
But do you not think it's true? Do you think he was just like confirming what he believes? You must believe that it's true.
I mean, well, obviously I believe that that it's true. What I wrote was true. So obviously he thought it was true as well. And it reflected a reality in the United States, which it was very difficult to express in the United States because of a fear of accusation of racism and other things.
Yes, I've had a guest on the
Although,
show.
of course, Thomas Sowell is himself black and had a difficult life in Georgia, so he knows all about life at the bottom.
I've had black guest on the show, Danielle, and she told me that even though she's black, because she's conservative, you see, some white liberals will call her the N-word. They will call her white supremacist because she has right-wing ideas. So it seems sometimes on the
conservative ideas rather than right-wing, perhaps.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's say that, and then she would be attacked and called all sorts of names because they feel justified. You don't have the right idea.
Well, I was very pleased. My books have been translated into Portuguese and have sold reasonably well in Brazil. And I gave a talk in Brazil, and I was very pleased when people came to buy the books. It's the only place in the world where young people rather than old people have bought my books.
Why is that?
I was that I can't tell you, but anyway, it was young people who bought my books, and there were a lot of them. And I was very pleased when someone said, "I grew up in the favelas, the slums of Sao Paulo." And he said, "I recognize all that you say." So it's an international phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon confined to England, though it's possibly worse in England than in other European countries.
Right. Why is it worse in England or in UK in general?
I'm not quite sure. I think it might have something to do with the general loss of the importance of the country, the dramatic loss of power and importance of the country. It's now no more important in the world really than Belgium, and this undermined any sense of being in a project larger than oneself, so that all that was left was individual liberty in the most in the most, shall we say, gross and destructive way.
So you would be saying that the empire, the British Empire, in some sense, not just, I wouldn't say just the empire, but the values that it had, and somehow held the country together more than now.
I think, I don't know about how, I wouldn't say that it held it together directly in any way, but the fact is that if you feel that you're in an important country, a country that is of world significance, you do actually feel something of that rubbing onto yourself. And one of the things that's happening in America, of course, is the realization that the United States is no longer the only or most important country in the world.
Yeah, I think there are several factors to this as well, because I've been following U.S. politics for a while, and the degradation of discourse just in the
Yes, it's
past 10
terrible.
years is, yeah, but I think it's a similar, there's parallels in UK, maybe, but in US is the most starking example. And that, of course, influences the whole Western world, you see.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly I'm surprised actually at the degradation of the discourse on all sides. I mean, it's not just one side or the other, it's everyone speaks in the most hideously vulgar terms. They very rarely address each other's arguments in any rational way. Insult is the highest form of argument, in fact. Of course, the same exists in this country. And you have only to look at, for example, at the commentary after a newspaper article is published to see the level of hatred and bile that people express, possibly because they're able to express it now, but I don't know whether the ability to express it has actually brought it forth, has created it, or whether it was always there waiting to come out. I rather think that the ability to express it increases it. So,
Right.
but anyway, the good thing for an author is that before long, the people who are commenting on your article are attacking not you, but each other, and wishing each other dead and all kinds of things. It's awful, it's horrible to see.
So with your work, did you ever get threats and stuff, because you are exposing a certain downside of the left, the lowering of standards of schools and things like that that are not.
No, personally, I've never, or at least I don't think I've ever suffered anything like that. Not that I'm aware of. I don't do Twitter and I don't do Facebook or anything like that. So for all I know, 20 million people are writing terrible things about me. But since I don't look at it, I don't know. But I've never really suffered anything very, very unpleasant. Part of it is because people who might have been expected to attack me didn't attack me, because they thought, well, as a doctor who's actually working, he's just reporting what he's seeing.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't very well say, well, it doesn't exist, because they have no contact with it. They don't know that it exists even, although they could easily if they wanted to. So that, for example, when I was in France, I went to the banlieue of Paris, which is like a slow-burning civil war. But in the center of Paris, with the people I know there, they wouldn't know that it exists.
Oh, they mean the precincts just around Paris, right?
Paris, yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
okay. Yeah, I've heard of that, but I never, when I was there, but I never went to visit there, because I was, I lived there, there was a station near Roosevelt. I think I lived near that station. There was a Catholic hostel, and so I lived in the 8th arrondissement, which is like one of the, the fancy.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, you don't see these problems there. And so there's a kind of geographical separation, actually a much greater geographical separation than in Britain. So it actually reminds me of South Africa, where I live. France reminds me a bit of South Africa, because you have these townships, as they would have been called in South Africa, where the poor black people lived, and they were completely separated from the center of the town. They came into the center of the town to work, of course, but they lived elsewhere. And if the government decided to turn off the trains and block the one road with a tank or an armored car, that was it. They were isolated from the center of the city. Well, you get that feeling very much in France, except, of course, that the relative populations, the proportions of the population are the reverse. So that in France, the poor people are the minority. In South Africa, they were the majority. But it did remind me very much, and my one accurate political prediction, it was the only one I've ever made that was in any sense unusual, and normally I get everything wrong, was that if the government, after the riots of 2005, you're probably too young to remember them, but there were riots throughout France, in the township, in the cities, in the banlieue, in France in 2005, not a single one occurred in the center of any town. It was all in the periphery. And I said that if the government decided to try and loosen the labor regulations in France, such that it would be easier for the unemployed people outside the cities to gain employment, there would be riots on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. And that's exactly what happened. And people were a bit annoyed because I said it reminded me all of the Witwatersrand in South Africa in 1922, when the mine owners wanted to introduce black labor into the mines, not because they like blacks, but because, of course, it was a lot cheaper than having white labor.
Hold on. So they wanted to make a law that made it easier for people outside the boroughs to work in Paris.
Yes, to reduce the regulation, so that it would be easier to hire and also, of course, to fire people.
Oh, I see.
Because they thought that one of the drivers of the riots was unemployment, because in some of these banlieue, there was at least 50% unemployment, and probably amongst the young people, 75% unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I said, in South Africa, in 1922, the mine owners wanted to reduce the barriers to black miners working in the mines, and the Communist Party of South Africa had a slogan. And the slogan was, "Workers of the world, unite for a white South Africa."
So it was economically detrimental plus racist.
Well, it wasn't. The plan probably was detrimental to, unfortunately, to a certain class of white miner. I mean, it was true. In a sense, what was being said was true, that the white miners would lose their jobs and they would be worse off for it.
Right.
And this is true of the rioters on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. They all had jobs, so they wanted to preserve their jobs from any possible competition.
Wow. So they didn't want somebody else to come in and take their jobs because they.
Well, they didn't want any reduction in the laws that protect labor once you have a job.
Right.
Once you have a job, you're.
Yeah, like unions. Like, and once you're in, you're fine.
Yeah, union. Yeah. If you're in within, it's good for you. If you're not in, then it's bad for you, and you have to make a choice about who you're going to assist.
I don't know if you realize, but Thomas Sowell has always mentioned the minimum wage in U.S. is the most anti-black law on the book, because once they raised minimum wage, started to raise increasingly in the 50s, because Thomas Sowell grew up, he was born in 1930. So he remembers when he was 16, 17, the minimum wage was existent, but it was so low, it was negligible. Like everybody could get a job that was higher than minimum wage. So the unemployment of young blacks, even during the economic segregation, they couldn't go to college and anything, was really low. The unemployment was really low. But when they raised the minimum wage, the unemployment of blacks just skyrocketed, and I don't think he's ever really recovered since then. And but they since had the 1965 the civil rights laws and stuff like that. But then that was coupled with some left-wing ideas that didn't seem to help and actually hurt the blacks even more. So like encouraging single motherhood. I think that's also in Britain as well, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's very very similar, and and the impulse for it, I should say, came from the intelligentsia. It didn't come from below. There weren't people from below demanding these changes in the law. It came from intellectuals and the governing classes from above.
Yeah, there's a classic YouTube video of Sowell arguing with Frances Fox Piven, which is a famous sociologist from Canada, and she was said Frances was saying that black people say this and black people say this, and Thomas Sowell quipped, "Oh, well, like most people, I have never seen a pollster," and
Yes,
the audience just roared in laughter, you know.
yes,
um,
yes. I mean, I think the question about the minimum wage is a technical economic one, and I think there are economists who say that it doesn't actually reduce employment, but and so I'm not really qualified to comment on that.
Yeah, that's
But
fair. That's fair. I want to go to your what was your intellectual background? Because
well, I have no intellectual background except that I was a doctor, and obviously I trained as a doctor. But I was always interested in reading, and I think that's now become a rather minority interest. But at the time, at the time it was fairly common. So we used to I and my friends used to discuss a lot of things. So and of course I'm just old enough to remember 1968, which had a tremendous effect. I have always thought that 1968 was the revolt of spoilt brats.
right.
That's how one can best think of it. Who, incidentally, are now in control or have recently been in control of society. The spoilt brats became the governors and are now themselves being overthrown by other spoilt brats. So
Even, but the new spoiled brats are even more radical than the old ones, so it keeps getting
yes,
worse.
they've probably actually got more to complain of in the sense that life in the future is going to be perhaps in some ways more difficult for them than it was for the 1968 spoiled brats. The outlook doesn't look terribly good for them, at least for those whose parents are not well off enough to be able to buy them a house and do all the other things that parents might do. So actually what's happened is that a class society has become seems to be becoming a caste society.
Did you already work as a doctor starting in the 70s, like 1970s?
In the 74, yeah, 74
Okay.
I started.
Okay, because I went to this 1 year college program in Scotland, and one of the books that they mentioned in sociology was Learning Through Labor, and it's a sociological study of these boys in England. I think it was close to Birmingham. I'm not sure, but this is a book by Paul Willis, 1977. Yeah, and it's titled "How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs," but it's written by Marxists. So it was blaming the system, as it were, on how the kids were. But my thinking was, it's probably, if you did a study in 1967, it'd probably look a lot different, because the kids they studied was like the lowest, like maybe what you would call in that book the underclass, because they were like they were not studying. The school were permissive. They were skipping class, but the teacher couldn't do anything. They were restricted. So these kids and the parents really didn't do anything. The parents were like, well, just, they're just having a laugh. That was the highest priority, having a laugh and getting away with things. And they're testing the teachers. How far can they get away with things,
Yeah.
But I'm thinking this happened in 1967. They get probably slapped in school or something. I don't know. It'd be probably very different in those 10 years.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that actually what decides a person's fate in life is largely what is going on in his mind, at least in a tolerably open society. Now, of course, the argument of the Marxists would be that this is not an open society, that you're destined to stay where you're born, and you're destined because of unfairness and injustice. However, The Guardian and other newspapers published a very interesting article some time ago about the household wealth in this country, broken down not by job or educational standard or anything like that, but by religious affiliation. And it was extremely interesting because the richest two groups by religious affiliation were Jews and Sikhs. And the history of both groups is more or less the same, namely that they arrived in the country, they weren't entirely, I mean, there was, of course, a gap of 60, 70 years between the arrival. But neither was extremely welcome by the local population. But neither was there any legal discrimination against them. So there was no reason why they couldn't, no legal reason why they couldn't ascend the social scale. And within a very few years, they went from being impoverished to being the richest groups in the country. And this seemed, and now unless you want to argue that there's some Jewish or Sikh conspiracy, which is preventing other people from doing the same, you would have to say, well, then what is important is something about these people's culture. And what is important, I mean, the most obvious things to me are their attitudes to education, also to work, and probably to family structure. And therefore, I had a debate with, I don't know whether you know Polly Toynbee. Have you heard of Polly Toynbee, who reads in The Guardian? You don't read The Guardian?
No, not particularly, you know.
Ah.
I try to avoid it. I try to avoid it usually.
I think you should.
Okay.
I think you should. Anyway, Polly Toynbee is a famous liberal, leftish columnist, journalist in The Guardian. And we had a debate about this. And she said to me, when I mentioned these facts, she said, well, what you have to remember is that immigrants are often people who are ambitious and hardworking. I said, yes, but that's precisely my point. That's what's important. And if you have a culture in which there is no ambition, in which, far from being ambitious, you want to cut down anybody who's ambitious in any sense whatsoever, then of course that group is not going to get very far. And I remembered a case. I worked in a very poor area where most of the patients were pretty poor. And I remember a girl, she was about 16 or 17, she came to me and I was talking about her, and she lived in a council housing estate where, you know, there's the usual crime and drugs and everything like that. And what she wanted to do was to study French literature, which is a rather extraordinary thing for someone from that background to want to do.
Mm.
I don't know how she decided it, but she had decided it, and I thought this was very meritorious. And she said, and what she said was that the other girls in her class said of her that she's stupid because she's clever.
That just amazing statement.
Well,
Postmodernism in one sentence, right there.
well, I mean, it sums up a culture. And if you have a culture in which you regard anybody who's clever as stupid, then it's unlikely that you're going to succeed very much in life.
Yes. It reminds me of there's a famous basketball player, Chris Paul, who would say to that kind of attitude, "Why would you want to be stupid?" Like, as a retort back. But he's pretty but he's pretty tough-nosed person, so he's able to stand up for himself, and he had good parenting. A lot of times these black youth in the United States don't have both parents, so that's harder. But he not only had parents, he had great grandparents who were also helping him. So so it seems like in a lot of ways, because of the degradation of family, just like in the United States, just like in Britain, that is somehow influencing the rest of society, the cohesion of society, let's say. Because I would say when you're a kid, like later on, maybe you can mentally, you can still do a lot of things. It's particularly now in the age of online learning, and you can do a lot with very little money. You can learn a lot, but it's hard to overcome the trauma of like one person parenting, single parents, and the harshness that can come with that.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, what you have to remember is that if you make generalizations about large numbers of people, huge numbers of people, there will always be exceptions. Like this girl was obviously exceptional in some way, but the local culture, if you like, instead of making it easier for her to be like that, made it much more difficult for her, and actually distressed her, because she didn't like to be the odd, I was going to say odd man out, I suppose I should say the odd girl out. Yeah. She didn't want to be the odd girl out. Yeah. And you have to be, and you shouldn't have to be exceptionally strong to pursue a constructive path through life.
Mm. Okay, so when you started your practice, before you started your practice, did you expect that you're gonna encounter so much negativity, or was this somehow forewarned to you?
No, I mean, what really changed me was going to Africa, and in fact, I spent a fair bit of time in Africa. I once, for example, crossed Africa by public transport from Zanzibar to Timbuktu, which took me about 6 months. Mm. And I observed the poverty there, which of course was incomparably greater than poverty in England. But there was a certain way in which the Africans, it struck me anyway, were less impoverished than the people in Britain that I've talked about. And that is that they had some kind of dignity and so on. Mainly perhaps because survival was an achievement there, which it isn't in Europe. I mean, there's no achievement to survival here. You can't not survive. You have no choice but to survive. But there it really was a bit of an achievement for many of them. But they were not, they were also refined in many ways. They were not vulgar. And they had, in most places, they had excellent manners. So the equation of poverty and bad manners or vulgarity is simply false.
So it's culture. It's mostly culture.
It's culture, yeah.
Do you think leniency of the police, because of the intelligentsia, and thinking crime is something that we can rehabilitate. There's a classic joke. It's not a joke, actually. It's a true story from the 1980s in New York, where there was this lenient judge, and he was getting everybody scot-free, like giving everybody another chance, and everybody just very lenient judge. And one day, this judge gets mugged, and he takes a week off work, and then he comes back to work, and he makes it a point to start with a statement, and everybody's quiet, and he's like, I know all of you have heard what happened, because it was all in the papers, in New York. And he says, but I want to let you know that what happened will in no way, shape, or form change the way I judge. And he let the silence sink into what he said. And somebody from the back of the courtroom yelled, "Mug him again!" So it wasn't enough. One wasn't enough. He should.
Yes.
And it seems like sometimes a liberal is one that was a conservative is a previous liberal that was mugged by reality,
Yes.
as it were. So the leniency, I think, is the problem, because
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the question, the first thing to say about crime, of course, is you never eradicate crime completely. There's no society in which it's eradicated completely. The second thing is to remember the distinction between what prevents people from becoming criminals in the first place and what you do once they have become criminals. These are overlapping questions, but they're not absolutely identical. So that, and no one really wants a society in which people behave in a law-abiding and decent way only because there's a policeman round the next tree who will grab you if you don't behave well, and you get sent to some terrible prison. No one wants a society like that.
That's China. Almost.
Well, I can give a story about that.
Right.
Yes. Yes. So we don't want that. On the other hand, there is no question that the failure of our police is in a kind of dialectical relationship with the extreme leniency of the courts. And it's not just a question of a few anecdotes. I mean, there are always anecdotes in the press about how somebody who's committed 27 violent crimes has gone on to kill somebody. And everyone asks, well, why was this person at liberty? But these are, and if you bring forward that case, then people say, oh, well, that's just an anecdote. But an anecdote that can be repeated 1,000 times or 100,000 times is not just an anecdote anymore. Mm-hmm. And the statistics are pretty clear. And if, for example, you look at some of the cases and the leniency with regard to killing people, for example, even culpable homicide, if you give lenient sentences to those people, and I can give cases where that is the case, that has been done, then you exert a downward pressure on all other sentences, because obviously the punishment has to some extent to be roughly proportional to the seriousness of the crime. So let me give you, this is a terrible case. The man did actually get a life sentence, but a life sentence in this country does not mean staying in prison for life. This was a man, I don't know, you probably don't remember, a man called Shane Jenkin, a terrible man who had come out of prison after kicking someone in the head and giving him brain damage, permanent brain damage. And he came out of prison and fell in with, he was a great big chap, muscular, strong, and so on. And fell in with a rather foolish woman who had 2 children, of course, by 2 previous relationships. She found him very attractive because he was muscular and strong. She wrote a book afterwards. She said that, you know, when he got undressed for the first time, she saw his tattoos, one of which was a man ripping off somebody else's head or something appalling like that. And she just thought it was funny, you know, even though the man had just come out of prison after 4 years. Anyway, to cut a long story short, after many episodes of violence towards her, in which she withdrew the charges against him, he put out her eyes with his bare finger. He got her drunk and drugged her. Now, I think if you ask the population what should happen to this man, I think almost everyone would say that this man should go to prison and there should be absolutely no possibility of him ever coming out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, even if he were to live to be 150, no possibility of him coming out because, well, I don't have to say why. I mean, it's obvious. Anyway, he will be out of prison probably in 6 years' time. And he'll still be young enough to be aggressive and violent. Now, if a man like that goes to prison for 6 years, what do you do about a burglar who just breaks into your house and steals a few things? But actually, do you know how I worked it out? How much a burglar, how much time a burglar could expect per burglary to spend in prison, and it's about 3 days. Wow. So if you look at the statistics of the sentences, the percentage of burglars who get caught, and so on, and most of the burglars who get caught, I think, want to be caught anyway, because that's the only way the police will ever catch anybody. So anyway, it's about 3 days. So the question is not why there are so many burglars, but why there are so few. Because if man were just an economic organism, everyone should be burgling, because surely you can take in a burglary more than 3 days labor will earn you.
But do they take away do they retrieve back the stuff they stolen always, or
sometimes, no? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
And it doesn't matter. They still get the 3 days, and that's it.
No, you still get the same.
Yeah, I think they.
I had a burglar. I looked in a burglar after 57 convictions. 57 convictions. Now the conviction rate is about less than 1 in 10 of all offences. This person had probably committed 500 offences. He got a £50 fine.
After the 57th time, £50 fine.
After the 57th time, and this was for a burglary.
Did they retrieve back the things he stolen?
Well, he probably didn't steal anything worth taking, actually, but because actually many burglars are not very clever, and
I can see.
And the other thing that liberals do not seem to be able to understand is that the principal victims of crime are the poor themselves. So if it's true that most criminals are poor or of the poorer background, it's also true that their victims are of the poor or poorer background.
Yes.
And therefore, if you don't incapacitate the criminals properly, what you're doing is creating more poor victims. I'm very unlikely to be the victim of a serious crime.
So but it's actually, wow.
But if I were living in a terrible housing estate, I would be likely to be the victim of a terrible crime because I would be vulnerable. I'm now 70, so I would be vulnerable. So I'd be much more likely. But this is so obvious, and yet nobody seems to be able to grasp the significance of it. So that when they think of the police as being the enemies of the poor, they forget that the police are actually, or should be, the first line of defense of the poor.
And they are. but they gets twisted
Well,
in the
much
media.
less than they should be.
Right. So
I mean, they, for example, will not take a burglary in a poor area seriously. Well, they won't even in a rich area.
what do you think about the it started in the US, maybe I don't know if it's in Britain now, but the whole defund the police movement because of Black Lives Matter, the racism, all that. It just seems I couldn't fathom a more dangerous idea than just get away with police and put in some social workers as if they are the saviors, the angels that are going to organize society for us.
Yes. Well, it reminds there was a cartoon, I think it was probably in Punch years ago, and it's about the Good Samaritan, and there's someone lying in the street, injured, obviously being attacked, and the social worker says to another, the people who did that obviously need help.
What about the guy lying there? Who's going to protect the guy? So it's almost like it's almost pathological. I don't know. You're the doctor or a psychiatrist. What is about the people that are like making excuses all day long for criminals that are obviously, I would say, with liberty, some of them are evil, like Shane, the guy you described, obviously evil. What is it about people?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm glad to say that people like Shane Jenkins are not, even now, they're not very common. Most criminals are. Most of the people I saw were not evil in that sense. So I think we should say the Shane Jenkins of this world are not very many. The problem, as I said, is that the leniency towards them exerts a pressure towards leniency for everybody else. Now, you ask, why do people not see these evident truths?
Yeah.
It would seem to me pretty evident truths. And I think it comes from a desire, first of all, it's because too many people are intellectuals now. And to be intellectual, you have to deny the obvious, because there's no point. there's no point in being an intellectual if you don't deny the obvious.
So it's the idea first, not the facts. First is the
oh yes,
assumptions.
absolutely.
The assumptions are paramount.
Nobody ever really gets much kudos, is regarded as a good person because he wants to be reasonably hard on crime. No, I mean, nobody. So that, for example, if you take, and this is going back a very long time, if you take, for example, Victor Hugo's book about the last 24 hours of the condemned man, the 24 hours before he's guillotined. And it's a very good book. But nowhere do we learn what this man has actually done to deserve being guillotined. And this is, I mean, this is so whether or not you agree with the death penalty. I don't really agree with the death penalty, but mainly because there are mistakes made and they execute innocent people. But the dice in the story are loaded in favor of sympathy for the man who's done something, and we don't know what the man has done. Maybe he's cooked and eaten his family. The same is true, incidentally, of the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is a very good poem. It's a very moving poem. But we don't ask, well, what's this man actually done? And it's known what he did. He was extremely a violent, jealous man who killed his girlfriend brutally. But that is not part of the poem. So our emotions are manipulated in one direction only.
Yes, to be sympathetic towards the evil guy that did something bad, but we are supposed to be.
And then, of course, there's the Dostoevskian view that the greater the sinner, the greater the saint. But there are some sins that that are so great that I won't say forgive, because I have no locus to forgive. Supposing someone comes and kills your girlfriend, I can't forgive him, and actually neither can you. The person who's suffered the most is, of course, the murdered person. It's not, you can so third parties can exert mercy, and mercy is a value, but it's not forgiveness. And these two things are often mixed up. Anyway, the point is that most intellectuals, their life, naturally enough, is with other intellectuals, and they therefore want to seem good and understanding and generous-hearted and not prejudiced, not censorious in the eyes of other intellectuals. So they don't actually care what happens on the ground.
Would you agree that a lot of intellectuals are very high on intellect? They're very smart, but they're very low in wisdom, because the Jordan Peterson proposes the idea that the two are not correlated at all. So some can have very high intellect, but their wisdom is almost non-existent. Whereas I'm for sure familiar with the movie Forrest Gump. The character had almost no intelligence, but very high in wisdom. Like, just amazing character-wise, but no intellect,
Yes, I mean, I don't want to sound too intellectual, anti-intellectual, because of course I suppose in a way I'm an intellectual myself. So, but there is certainly a tendency of people. You need a certain level of education and sophistication to believe the most idiotic things.
But
I mean, you can't. Just look at the record of Western intellectuals with regard to the Soviet Union. It
supporting
wasn't supporting it. And it's not true that the information wasn't available. It was available from the very beginning. I've got a collection, quite a large collection of books about the Soviet Union, published in actually published from about 1918, all through the Second World War.
I'm sorry, can you be a little back so we can see your face?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yes. From 1918 to the beginning of the Second World War, and everything was known. Everything was known. The size of the camps, the famines, it was all the persecution of religious people and others. It was all perfectly well known. It was just that nobody wanted to believe it.
They wanted to believe it. It's like on a faith. It's like intellectualism became, because most of these people are without religion, but they place their faith in something that is not entirely positive, in an ideology, especially communism, that produced negative results objectively. But still, as an intellectual, you have to be intellectual to say, oh, it wasn't bad, or it wasn't real Marxism. It was just something about implementation that was just wrong.
Yes.
It reminds me of an old Soviet joke where one asked the other, is this full communism? Is this it? And the other guy says, well, no, things are going to get a lot worse. That's,
yes.
Yes. And Ronald Reagan used to collect Soviet jokes, so that's where I got it from.
Yes. Well, there are a lot of very good ones.
Yes.
I mean, that was one thing in which they were very good. Very good jokes they had.
Yeah. Yes, and economically it was a disaster. They would, for example, I read in a Soul book that they would lie between the supplier would say that he needs more, and the other guy would have to guess how much the other guy was overestimating. And it was all these, because each position has its incentive, but you can't lie too much or you get executed or sent to Siberia. So it's like, It's
But
a
I
whole.
suppose actually again, the surprising thing was that anything was produced. Not
Yes.
that was what was surprising, not that it didn't produce very well.
But I think they had to, otherwise they'd be killed. They knew they had their neck on the line, so they had to produce something.
Yes, on the other hand, people were killed pretty much randomly. So
Yes.
often there wasn't much you couldn't predict very clearly what was going to happen to you. No, I think, and even when the Soviet Union became more bearable in the sense that it became only very oppressive rather than murderous, um, it was very surprising that anything was produced.
Talking about the Soviet Union, one of the characteristics is the ugliness of the building, the architecture,
Yes.
the where people lived, and unfortunately, some of this has been transported by capitalism in a way that they wanted to make cheap buildings and just do utilitarian buildings, and I saw that when I lived mostly in Scotland and UK. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of the houses look like bomb shelters. They are just gray. They have small windows. There's nothing going. They're
Yes, of
probably
course.
built in the 70s.
Yes. But
But
there's a long, I'm very interested in that question, and there's a long history of it. And it goes back to the modernism and the catastrophe of modernism from just after the First World War. The First World War was responsible for a lot of terrible things, in my opinion. And people like Gropius and Le Corbusier, who is responsible for this kind of stuff ultimately. He was a fascist. He was a real, I don't mean fascist in the metaphorical sense, I mean it in the literal sense. And these were people who wanted all buildings in the whole world to be built in the same way. And Le Corbusier, the plan voisin, he wanted to knock down half of Paris and make it into some kind of Novosibirsk. And with
what
his
is that?
tall Novosibirsk, the town in Siberia, the city in Siberia. So he wanted to build just huge identical towers. Now you would think that any person who even entertained such an idea would be immediately disqualified from ever building anything anywhere in the world. But
Right.
far from that, he's come to dominate the world, or his style has come to dominate the world, including Glasgow, and virtually every place in Britain has been ruined aesthetically by these buildings. Practically everyone, and even now they're still at it. The architects.
I was with a friend in Ljubljana like a week ago, the capital city of Slovenia, because that's where I am right now.
Yes.
And he's a professor of architecture, and he was showing me the difference between the classical building, the secessionist, and then you see the modern building. And usually, sometimes the modern building, while it looks hideous, sometimes it even has a hideous color on it as well.
Yes.
Yes. And it seems like the classical buildings had everything, the color, the design, everything around the windows. And this friend wanted me to tell you, I don't know if you're familiar with Christopher Alexander's work.
Yes. Yes.
But there's apparently a school inspired by him in Italy called Building Beauty School of Architecture that's attempting to bring, I guess, beauty in architecture again, which I think is needed, because if we had more buildings like that, there's something about being surrounded by beauty as compared to building some of the buildings you see in Britain. It's just very sad.
Yeah, well, it's almost everywhere. I mean, the French modern architects are abominable. absolutely abominable. I don't know whether did you see the Philharmonie in Paris?
I
The
don't know
new
by name.
Philharmonic Hall? Probably not. I mean, if you haven't been there recently, well, they spent hundreds of millions on it, hundreds of millions. So you can't say it's because they haven't got any money.
Mm.
Hundreds of. It is. I mean, it's so awful that it makes you almost want to laugh, and you don't know whether to laugh or kill yourself. And,
But the
and
thing is, somebody must have thought this is a good idea. We should do this, and you
well,
know.
it was the most famous French architect, Jean Nouvel, who did it. And actually, if I were a very rich man, what I would like to do is to fund a very large prize for architectural students, maybe $50,000 a year, shall we say. And I would give them a building, for example, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, or the Philharmonie, or many buildings in Britain. And I say, now, you have to design, you have 500 million euros or pounds or dollars or whatever, and you have to design something worse than this. You know,
Why worse?
design something worse. Because that would take real imagination. Right? It wouldn't be easy. And the prize, of course, would go to the person who managed to produce the ugliest, the worst building. And I think it would be a very good prize, because it would make students of architecture think, what is so terrible about these buildings?
I thought you would say you build up something classical, something beautiful, like the
No,
Louvre
no,
without
no.
the Louvre without the pyramid, and something like
Yeah,
that. Like really.
yeah. No, no, no. You go, or you give them you give them a city, shall we say, Venice, and say, ruin it with one building.
That seems a bit counterproductive.
Well, I think it would be. I mean, I'm not suggesting that what they design should actually be built. I'm only suggesting that they should try, because this will tell them actually much more than trying to build something beautiful. It would be a kind of paradoxical intention.
So you maybe they would stumble upon beauty by seeking for ugliness.
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
maybe this school building like building beauty school would have some students that would be probably eager to design a building that they think is beautiful.
Yes. Well, anyway, the fact is, however, I mean, it is very serious, because our architectural schools, I understand, I'm not an expert on them, but I know people who know them. They are completely indifferent to what the vast majority of people would consider beauty. And actually, if you look at architectural criticism, modern architectural criticism, very rarely does it have anything directly aesthetic in it. They say it's interesting. This is an interesting solution to that problem, or whatever. But it won't actually say this is beautiful, and we like just looking at it. They won't say that. So there's a, and it's not just architecture, it's also art. The other day, because I write a little column called Philistine's Corner in an art magazine, I looked at the director of the Tate Gallery in Britain talking with somebody else, some sort of 700th rate artist. And she was introduced, they were introduced by some other important person in the Tate Gallery, who was talking about the kind of art that we should be supporting with public funds and so on. Mm-hmm. And it should be challenging, and it should be transgressive, and so on. Never once was any aesthetic quality mentioned in what the art should be. Not once. It was simply not part of his worldview, if you like.
Right. So they make whatever they want, they think is beautiful, and
They don't think it's beautiful.
oh
They don't
well
think it.
well
They
well
don't.
they
Or
think
at
it's
least they
art.
don't say. They don't say it's beautiful. They don't claim. They don't make a
Right.
claim for beauty. It's just that they don't think beauty is very important, and they think that. I suppose they believe that most people's view of beauty is a chocolate box, is kitsch. And of course, it's true that a lot of people do have a taste for kitsch. That's true. But uh, but it's if you look at great art of the past, it's possible to depict things which in themselves are extremely ugly, but with great aesthetic sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before the groups, the Sikhs and the Jews in Britain that are doing well. There was a book written by an author that wrote. Uh, she was called Tiger Mother. I don't know her name right now, but
Yes, I
she.
know. Yes, I've actually
Yes.
spoken on a platform with her. Yes.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah.
So she wrote an interesting book about groups in the U.S. that do well, and there was a couple of groups, and there were Jews as well, but there were Mormons and Nigerians and some other groups. There were about 5 or 6 different groups, but it seems to me most of them are connected to a religion, and it seems to me that Britain and all across actually the Western world, America is an exception because I think it is more religious still than compared to especially
Yeah.
Scotland
Although
or
its
yeah,
religion is it's very peculiar. Its religion is very peculiar. But anyway, yes.
right. So do you think that has something to do as well, the loss of religion since the 1950s and 60s in Britain? Maybe that has something to do with that as well.
It's been going on. Yes, it's been going on for longer than that because Matthew Arnold spoke in the 1840s of the long, melancholy withdrawing roar of religion, even in the 1840s. Um, and it certainly got some connection, for example, with the loss of beauty in architecture,
Mhm.
because we no longer have any idea of building anything for eternity. I mean, we don't build for eternity. We build for 30 years and then we knock it down again and start again. And in fact, the building regulations are that a building should be able to stand up for 30 years. Well, you can't. Can you imagine telling Michelangelo, well, what we want is something that will last for 30 years?
And then we'll just run it down. Or
so,
the great
so,
cathedrals, sometimes it takes more than 30 years to even build the cathedral, you know.
well, it took hundreds of years in some cases, yeah.
Yes.
So, but on the other side, of course, it doesn't take long to ruin them. So you could, so we are capable of ruining anything almost instantaneously.
I want to
So
go
yes, I
to.
think, but I have to admit that I'm not at all religious. So
Oh, okay.
I'm not
I want
I'm
to
not
go.
anti I'm not anti-religious either. But
Are you agnostic,
yes.
basically?
Well, I'm not even, I wouldn't really agnostic. Let's put it like this. I don't expect to survive my own death.
Well, okay. But what will happen to your surprise if you do, and you like realize, oh, this is
Well,
there's something
it
more.
depends where I go. It depends what I find when I get there.
I don't think you will go to a bad place based on your. Well, you see, it's to me. I have a Catholic, well, Christian background, and but I've been into some other stuff before, and it seems to me that it is not just the belief system, and this would be heresy to some Christians to say, but it seems to me that it's not just the belief system itself; it's the the character of the person, the character of the soul, and all that. And if a person, I think, honestly believes that there is something nothing doesn't believe. You don't have to. I don't think he can believe, like Carl Jung said, I don't believe in things just for the sake of believing it. But Carl Jung had a distinct I think, privileged to having kind of experienced the presence of God. In his autobiography, he talks about that. So he had a different experience. So he didn't have to believe because he knew he was, so, so yeah, that's my, anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. I want to talk about, because you went to North Korea apparently for a little bit, right?
Yes, under strange circumstances. Yes.
So, because a lot of people in the West, they're very, they say the Western culture is so bad, so terrible, and I always joke, they should send them to a holiday, to a working camp, maybe for a week or a month or whatever, so they experience, the same meal every day, no television, or one television that you don't understand the Korean anyway, and just the strictness, everybody's same hairstyle, no books. So because you experienced there, I think, in one of the books you mentioned that somebody had somehow discovered Shakespeare, and he read that with great gusto, and he was like, oh, this was he was.
Well, yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. It was in Pyongyang, and this was 1989. And I came out of the Great People's Study House. Pyongyang is an extraordinary city because it's huge open spaces and no traffic. So you have 13 lane roads, but no cars. And, or you did then. I don't know what it's like now. I can't imagine it's changed very much. And as Custine says in his book, Russia in 1839, he says this at Petersburg, a crowd would be a revolution. That is to say, if people gathered spontaneously rather than under direction, this would be the end of the regime. And but anyway, so I came out of this huge space, out of the Great People's Study House, which was a bit like a fascist mausoleum mixed with a pagoda, and as I walked across, incidentally, there was no contact, no spontaneous contact possible with North Koreans. That's impossible, except on this one occasion. This chap crossed me, and as we walked past, we were the only ones in this huge open space. He said, "Do you speak English?" So I said, "Yes." And he said, "I am a student of the Foreign Languages Institute." And the one thing communists did very, very well is teach foreign languages in the foreign language institutes. They really did do it very, very well. And he said to me, reading Dickens and Shakespeare is the greatest, the only joy of my life, which was an extraordinary thing to say. And it was obvious to me that what he meant by it was that both in Dickens and in Shakespeare, people, however poor they were, however downtrodden, they spoke with their own voice. They were free to speak with their own voice, whatever the terrible qualities of their life in other respects. And that was impossible in North Korea. You had to repeat what you were told. You had to read the same things, and so on and so forth. And he was reading Dickens and Shakespeare, partly because I suppose his teachers thought that this showed how terrible life outside North Korea was, but also to teach them extremely good English. I mean, to think of someone mastering English in Korea to the point where he could read Shakespeare is astonishing. But anyway, that's what he said.
Mm.
And then he said, I was there for a festival of youth and International Festival of Youth and Students, which was a kind of communist jamboree, which was held every 4 years in one capital or the other. And this was the last one that was ever held, and it was in Pyongyang. And it caused a famine in the country because they had to feed all the students and there was no surplus food. So we were eating the food of the people, really. Anyway, he said, would it be correct English, he said, to say that this festival is as welcome as the snow before the harvest. And I said, well, you would know better than I. And then that was the end of the conversation. No other conversation was possible. And he obviously couldn't be seen talking to me for any length of time.
Or he would be possibly executed as a traitor.
Even this was probably dangerous for him. But anyway, I thought it was possibly the most extraordinary conversation I've ever had in my life.
Wow.
Because, of course, just he was obviously a very clever chap. Because in 3 sentences, he illuminated everything.
Yeah. The being pithy and being concise with your ideas shows clear thinking.
Yes. In this case, he, well, dare I say it, he found someone who understood what he meant. At least I think he did.
Do you know?
I wonder what happened. This is now 31 years ago, so I wonder what happened to that chap.
Was he young?
Yes. Yeah. He was young. He was young.
He's probably still alive then. Probably.
Well, other things being equal. Yes.
Are you familiar with the work of Eric Hoffer?
I did read a book of his once, but I'm afraid it's rather past my.
We talked about intellectuals, and Eric Hoffer is one of my favorite philosophers, and he said in one of the interviews he had a very interesting quote, and I'm interested what you have to say about it. He said, "It's disconcerting to realize that businessmen, generals, and soldiers, and men of action are less corrupted by power than intellectuals. You take a conventional man of action, and he's satisfied if you obey, but not the intellectual. He doesn't want you just to obey. He wants to get down on your knees and praise the one that makes you love what you hate and hate what you love. In other words, wherever the intellectuals are in power, there's soul raping going on." So do you think that is true in some sense, especially in North Korea? That's a classic example of
yes, it's not 100% true, because if you take in a different society, you'd have to say that someone like Gladstone in this country was an intellectual, and also, I suppose, Disraeli. If you count a novelist as an intellectual, then he was an intellectual, and yet they. I don't think you couldn't call them totalitarians.
Right. I think it depends how much power they have, because in communist country, obviously Lenin, when he was intellectual, yes, he took it over. Then seems like power corrupted him a lot more than maybe a conventional man of action.
I think he was deeply corrupt before. Morally, he was morally corrupt. So I don't think power corrupted him. He wanted the power because he was so corrupt. Morally corrupt.
Okay. That seems fair.
I don't mean he was. Yeah.
I want to touch on also schools in UK. I noticed a very left-leaning as well. I had one of my professors, we talked before, was openly a Marxist. Very young, but I'm not going to mention names, but you know who you are. Openly a Marxist.
If he's watching.
Oh, I assume he might be one of these days. And so what is it about the education system in Britain and also in the United States to a large extent that a lot of education seems to be so left-leaning?
Well, are you asking me why that is? Did you?
Yes. Why do you think that is so?
I suppose it's because it's long been assumed that the left is virtuous because it says it is.
That's not enough. That's not enough.
Well, it isn't enough. I mean, people talk about the long march through the institutions. And that has happened. I mean, I take the example of there was a dispute between Isaiah Berlin and Isaac Deutscher. Isaiah Berlin, you know about Isaiah Berlin. Do you know about Isaiah Berlin?
I'm afraid not. Can you illuminate who?
Well, he was a famous intellectual historian and political philosopher whose background was, he was Jewish, but he was of the high merchant class of St. Petersburg. And he left Russia because of the revolution when he was very young. And more or less, I mean, he was very clever, obviously, and he entered the British establishment, university establishment, and also political establishment very easily, without any difficulty at all. And he was a very good writer, and he was amusing, and in many ways a brilliant man. And he was an old-fashioned liberal. I mean, he genuinely believed that there should be differences of opinion in universities and that people should be able to talk to one another. Isaac Deutscher was of Polish origin, Polish Jewish origin, who came from a much lower social class, but was also extremely clever, as anybody must who writes extremely good English, must be, who writes extremely good English when it's his fourth or fifth language. I mean, this is astonishing to me. Anyway, Deutscher was a Marxist and wrote a 3-volume hagiography of Trotsky, which Deutscher thought, Berlin thought was dishonest. And he thought Deutscher was a very dishonest and dangerous man, and therefore prevented him from finding any academic employment in Britain. And he was so powerful and influential that he was, at the time, I don't know whether anybody could do that now, but he did it. And he said that I didn't do it because he was a Marxist. I'm quite happy to have Marxists in universities, but I won't have someone as dishonest as Deutscher. Now, the point about this story is that a genuine liberal like Berlin was happy to have Marxists in department, and he thought the Marxists would reciprocate the liberality, but that was not their idea. And so by degrees we've had an increasing uniformly left-wing view of the world, to such an extent that if now you apply to a university, it's quite likely that you will be asked what you are going to do for diversity and inclusion in the university, meaning uniformity, of course. Diversity means
you mean as a professor if you apply for a university?
Yes, if you apply for a position in the university. I don't know enough to know how widespread that is, but it's certainly quite widespread, not just in Britain, but in the United States, where it's almost universal, and also in European countries.
My reply to that would be, well, how are we gonna bring intellectual diversity to the campus? And that would destroy the whole entire thing.
Well, that is a very good question, and I have no answer to it.
The last thing I want to go over is Brexit, and Brexit is a huge controversial thing kind of controversial thing that happened. And I found through my research that, not surprisingly, that about more than 90% of professors in UK voted to remain.
Yes.
Voted against Brexit.
Is that of all subjects, or yes?
I'm thinking the higher, I think it's the higher educate, like a university level kind of
yes,
education. And that's
Yes.
not surprising, because it's just like we said before, it's very left wing, but it seems they are uniformly against Brexit. But what do you think of, personally, what do you think Brexit is going to bring to the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the fact is, of course, that our governing class and our bureaucracy is at least as bad as any in Europe. So, and this has been revealed recently very clearly. It seems to me, or it seemed to me from the very beginning, that the negotiations were bound to be very difficult. In fact, as Varoufakis said, they shouldn't have even started negotiations if they wanted to get out of the European Union. They should just have said, "We've left, and that's it," and then you start negotiating.
Yeah.
Because it's obvious that for both sides, it's an existential question, because if Brexit is not a disaster for Britain, even if things continue more or less as they were, this is a disaster for the European Union. Because if it's not a disaster for Britain, what is the European Union for? So it was obvious from the very beginning, except to people like Mrs. May, that it was essential for the European Union to make things as difficult and as bad for Britain as possible.
Well, this is, I think if Trump was negotiating, because there's something I like about the Art of the Deal that I read is, I think that's where it says that one of the strongest negotiating position is if you have the power to walk away at any time. But the UK never is in that position. It's always like begging, like, we want to be here, we want to negotiate.
Yeah.
And that's coming from a power of weakness, position of weakness. Yeah.
I mean, whether it was intrinsically weak or whether it was weak because the people in charge were so weak, are weak. And after all, you have to remember that most of the people who are negotiating don't actually believe what they're negotiating for. Most of the bureaucracy was, like your professors, was against it in the first place.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's doomed from the start. You have to get
so it's doomed from the start. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there were always arguments for and against. The arguments for were never really economic because, I mean, I don't want to sound alarmist, but what we are building, what Europe is building, what we are building in Europe is another Yugoslavia, but on a much bigger scale.
What do you mean that it's another Yugoslavia?
Well, they're going to have rotating presidencies, and they're going to force these countries together into a union, which eventually will break apart. I hope not violently, because the interests of the various parts of it are so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the interests of Portugal are not the same as the interests of Germany, and the interests of Germany are not the same as those of Greece or Estonia and Italy.
Yeah, I think Thomas Sowell shares your skepticism about the cohesion of the European Union in the long term. And
in the long term, they can keep it going for quite a long time, as Yugoslavia was kept going under Marshal Tito.
But that was also a little force as well. A little camp here and there. Some people disappeared. That was a little force. European Union cannot afford to be the same because otherwise, in the day of age of social media, I think it wouldn't last that long if they started on that route. But who knows?
Who knows? No. Who knows? No,
So
I'm not suggesting that they would, but all I'm suggesting is that when you force countries together, which are very different, don't speak each other's languages and have very different cultures and so on, and eventually, I mean, the aim is supposedly the ever closer union. Well, I mean, what does the ever closer union mean? It can only mean in the end that very similar conditions are forced on very different countries.
everybody
So,
speak
but
German.
maybe that,
No, I'm kidding.
what? Yes,
I said
yes.
everybody speak German. No, I'm kidding. It's
Yeah.
blasphemous
No,
to
I'm
say
afraid everyone will speak a version of English, which will be worse.
that. Well, I think we've come to an end here. Actually, would you want a quick comment on Donald Trump? What do you think? How do you think his 3 years are going so far, or 4?
Well, I always thought, I mean, there's a difference between what he's actually done and what the man is. I mean,
Of course.
to me, the man is utterly repellent. I mean, you know, he has. I can't think of any virtues that he has, but I can think of many vices. On the other hand, if you didn't know who it was who had ruled America and said, well, has he done a good job or a bad job? You would say, well, he's done a good job in some respects and maybe it's a bad job in other respects, like any other political figure. The problem with him is he is so revolting that people who are opposed to him can't think of anything except his vices. And so, so the criticisms of him are usually, beyond reason.
Personal like attacks, but
But I always thought that in the end he is going to reinforce the very tendencies that he's supposed to be against, because in politics there's always, well, at least if there's any freedom, there's always a reaction against something, and when the reaction comes against him, and after all the demography really is probably against him, it will be terrible.
well, the Black Lives Matter and all that is very radicalized. They're Marxist. The organization of Black Lives Matter is Marxist, and it seems to come into head. But I got a sense when he first got elected that I thought this is the beginning of the long road of ending of political correctness, meaning that it will take.
I think it'll be the reinforcement of political correctness.
Okay, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope you're right, but I mean the problem is you've already mentioned that the discourse has become extremely vulgar and
yes,
and so on, and as I said, when the other side gets its chance, as it will one day, I mean, maybe not this time. I actually expect Donald Trump to win the election.
same.
But again, I'm not very good at predicting these things, so I might be completely wrong. But at some time there's going to be a reaction against him, and people are so in the United States seem to be so incapable of being in the same room together if they're of different opinions, that when the reaction comes, it's likely to be a very strong one.
Well, but one thing that's happens, I don't know if you know, walk away movement. There's a thing called hashtag walk away, that many people are walking away from the Democratic Party. So because precisely in the last, particularly in the past 2 years, because they see the behavior of the left and some of the things that they're doing are so radical that some people are like, wait a minute, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And then once they start free thinking and once they start researching from themselves, then it's over. That's the beginning of the end. And they're like, and then in about 6 months, they're like, they come out with a video, I'm walking away from the Democratic Party. And if they're black, they say plantation. So
So,
So it's
but what kind of figures are these, or percentages? Do you know? Or,
I don't know, but I imagine if, because for one person that does the video, there must be 10 videos that don't, that there must be tens of people or 100 people that don't make the video because they don't want to be, you know, public.
yes,
So I do believe there is a movement, and this kind of radicalization actually helps
Trump.
it in a way, because things always, my prediction is things will get worse before they get better, but they need to get worse because we need to see what does the Marxism really look like. And it looks like, you know, I don't know if you saw this in Seattle a couple months ago. They took over.
Yes,
Yeah, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. They have their own police. Politically, they don't believe in the borders with Mexico, but that place in Seattle had its own police and its own borders. So, you know, it's
yes,
just ridiculousness.
yes, yeah. Well, I mean, you might be right, but it depends whether the radical Democrats can build a coalition of sufficient size that it can win elections. After all, the Social Democrats in Sweden said we only need 51% of the population and we're in power for good, because what we'll do is create our own interest groups. So, who knows? Who knows? I think if they can have a few more good riots, and a few more incidents like the one, was it yesterday or the day before, where someone goes and kills or shoots at two policemen in a car, then I think Trump will win.
Who shot the policeman and one of
Well,
someone?
there was a video of a young person going up to a police car which was just by the side of the road with two policemen in it, and he shot them through the window and
Oh
then
my
ran
God.
away.
I think I saw it, but I didn't believe it. I thought he was pointing and joking, but I guess he
Well,
was.
no, he wasn't joking. He actually shot them, and they were injured. And then there was a demonstration a small one, outside the hospital where the policeman and a policewoman had been taken, where they were saying that they wanted them to die, and that the police were the biggest gang or most dangerous gang of all. Now we just need a few more incidents like that, and I think Donald Trump will win easily. But who knows? I'm not a prophet.
Okay, well, on that note, we shall end this podcast. I want to thank you very much for
You're
being
welcome.
here. I think it was very good experience, and hopefully, you know, you'll promote your work as well, because I think more people need to see your work and watch your lectures and talks, and because you provide an insight. Because you said you're intellectual, but I would say because of your clinical background, your end product isn't solely ideas, because you saw as a doctor, you were pragmatically working with people. So your end product was never just ideas, because you were a clinical doctor and psychiatrist. So yeah, just want to thank you very much for being on the program.
Well, thank you for asking me.
And everybody, thank you for watching and listening.